Number 8 of A Christmas Miscellany, 2018, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Number 8, The Mistletoe Bough, by Anthony Trollope. "Let the boys have it if they like it," said Mrs. Garrow, pleading to her only daughter on behalf of her two sons. "Pray don't, mamma," said Elizabeth Garrow. "It only means romping. To me all that is detestable, and I am sure it is not the sort of thing that Miss Holmes would like." "Well, we always had it at Christmas when we were young." "But, mamma, the world is so changed." The point in dispute was one very delicate in its nature, hardly to be discussed in all its bearings, even in fiction, and the very mention of which between mother and daughter showed a great amount of close confidence between them. It was no less than this: should that branch of mistletoe which Frank Garrow had brought home with him out of the Lowther Woods be hung up on Christmas Eve in the dining room at Thwaite Hall, according to his wishes? Or should permission for such hanging be positively refused? It was clearly a thing not to be done after such a discussion, and therefore the decision given by Mrs. Garrow was against it. I am inclined to think that Miss Garrow was right in saying that the world is changed as touching mistletoe boughs. Kissing, I fear, is less innocent now than it used to be when our grandmothers were alive, and we have become more fastidious in our amusements. Nevertheless, I think that she made herself fairly open to the raillery with which her brothers attacked her. "On y soit qui mal y pense," said Frank, who was 18. "Nobody will want to kiss you, my dear Finears," said Harry, who was just a year younger. "Because you choose to be a Puritan, there are to be no more cakes and ale in the house," said Frank. "Still waters run deep, we all know that," said Harry. The boys had not been present when the matter was decided between Mrs. Garrow and her daughter, nor had the mother been present when these little amenities had passed between the brother and sister. "Only that mamma has said it wouldn't seem to go against her," said Frank. "But as my father, he wouldn't give way to such nonsense, I know." Elizabeth turned away without answering and left the room. Her eyes were full of tears, but she would not let them see that they had vexed her. They were only 2 days home from school, and for the last week before their coming, all her thoughts had been to prepare for their Christmas pleasures. She had arranged their rooms, making everything warm and pretty. Out of her own pocket she had bought a shot bolt for one and skates for the other. She had told the old groom that her pony was to belong exclusively to Master Harry for the holidays, and now Harry told her that still waters ran deep. She had been driven to the use of all her eloquence in inducing her father to purchase that gun for Frank, and now Frank called her a Puritan. And why? She did not choose that a mistletoe bough should be hung in her father's hall when Godfrey Holmes was coming to visit him. She could not explain this to Frank, but Frank might have had the wit to understand it. But Frank was thinking only of Patty Coverdale, a blue-eyed little romp of 16, who, with her sister Kate, was coming from Penrith to spend the Christmas at Thwaite Hall. Elizabeth left the room with her slow, graceful step, hiding her tears, hiding all emotion, as latterly she had taught herself that it was feminine to do. "There goes my Lady Fine Airs," said Harry, sending his shrill voice after her. Thwaite Hall was not a place of much pretension. It was a moderate-sized house, surrounded by pretty gardens and shrubberies, close down upon the River Eamont, on the Westmoreland side of the river, looking over to a lovely wooded bank in Cumberland. All the world knows that the Eamont runs out of Ullswater, dividing the two counties, passing under Pendrith Bridge, and by the old ruins of Brougham Castle, below which it joins the Eden. Thwaite Hall nestled down close upon the clear, rocky stream about half-way between Ullswater and Penrith, and had been built just at a bend of the river. The windows of the dining parlour and of the drawing-room stood at right angles to each other, and yet each commanded a reach of the stream. Immediately from a side of the house steps were cut down through the red rock to the water's edge, and here a small boat was always moored to a chain. The chain was stretched across the river, fixed to the staples driven into the rock on either side, and the boat was pulled backwards and forwards over the stream, without aid from oars or paddles. From the opposite side a path led through the woods and across the fields to Penrith, and this was the route commonly used between Thwaite Hall and the town. Major Garrow was a retired officer of engineers, who had seen service in all parts of the world, and who was now spending the evening of his days on a small property which had come to him from his father. He held in his own hands about 20 acres of land, and he was the owner of one small farm close by, which was let to a tenant. That, together with his half pay and the interest of his wife's £1,000, sufficed to educate his children and keep the wolf at a comfortable distance from his door. He himself was a spare, thin man, with quiet, lazy, literary habits. He had done the work of life, but had so done it as to permit of his enjoying that which was left to him. His sole remaining care was the establishment of his children, and, as far as he could see, he had no ground for anticipating disappointment. They were clever, good-looking, well-disposed young people, and upon the whole it may be said that the sun shone brightly on Thwaite Hall. Of Mrs. Garrow it may suffice to say that she always deserved such sunshine. For years past it had been the practice of the family to have some sort of gathering at Thwaite Hall during Christmas. Godfrey Holmes had been left under the guardianship of Major Garrow, and as he had always spent his Christmas holidays with his guardian, this perhaps had given rise to the practice. Then the Coverdales were cousins of the Garrows, and they had usually been there as children. At the Christmas last past the custom had been broken, for young Holmes had been abroad. Previous to that they had all been children, excepting him, but now that they were to meet again they were no longer children. Elizabeth, at any rate, was not so, for she had already counted 19 winters, and Isabella Holmes was coming. Now Isabella was 2 years older than Elizabeth, and had been educated in Brussels. Moreover, she was comparatively a stranger at Thwaite Hall, never having been at those early Christmas meetings. And now I must take permission to begin my story by telling a lady's secret. Elizabeth Garrow had already been in love with Godfrey Holmes, or perhaps it might be more becoming to say that Godfrey Holmes had already been in love with her. They had already been engaged, and alas, they had already agreed that that engagement should be broken off. Young Holmes was now 27 years of age, and was employed in a bank at Liverpool, not as a clerk, but as assistant manager, with a large salary. He was a man well-to-do in the world, who had money also of his own, and who might well afford to marry. Some 2 years since, on the eve of leaving Thwaite Hall, he had with low doubting whisper told Elizabeth that he loved her, and she had flown trembling to her mother. "Godfrey, my boy," the father said to him as he parted with him the next morning, "Bessie is only a child, and too young to think of this yet." At the next Christmas Godfrey was in Italy, and the thing was gone by. So at least the father and mother said to each other. But the young people had met in the summer, and one joyful letter had come from the girl home to her mother. "I have accepted him. Dearest, dearest mamma, I do love him. But don't tell papa yet, for I have not quite accepted him. I think I am sure, but I am not quite sure. I am not quite sure about him." And then, 2 days after that, there had come a letter that was not at all joyful. "Dearest mamma, it is not to be. It is not written in the book. We have both agreed that it will not do. I am so glad that you have not told dear papa, for I could never make him understand. You will understand, for I shall tell you everything, down to his very words. But we have agreed that there shall be no quarrel. It shall be exactly as it was, and he will come at Christmas all the same. It would never do that he and papa should be separated, nor could we now put off Isabella. It is better so in every way, for there is, and need be, no quarrel. We still like each other. I am sure I like him, but I know that I should not make him happy as his wife. He says it is my fault. I, at any rate, have never told him that I thought it his. From all which it will be seen that the confidence between the mother and daughter was very close. Elizabeth Garrow was a very good girl, but it might almost be a question whether she was not too good. She had learned, or thought that she had learned, that most girls are vapid, silly, and useless, given chiefly to pleasure-seeking and a hankering after lovers, and she had resolved that she would not be such a one. Industry, self-denial, and a religious purpose in life were the tasks which she set herself, and she went about the performance of them with much courage. But such tasks, though they are excellently well adapted to fit a young lady for the work of living, may also be carried too far, and thus have the effect of unfitting her for that work. When Elizabeth Garrow made up her mind that the finding of a husband was not the only purpose of life, she did very well. It is very well that a young lady should feel herself capable of going through the world happily without one. But in teaching herself this, she also taught herself to think that there was a certain merit in refusing herself the natural delight of a lover, even though the possession of the lover were compatible with all her duties to herself, her father and mother, and the world at large. It was not that she had determined to have no lover. She made no such resolve, and when the proper lover came, he was admitted to her heart. But she declared to herself unconsciously that she must put a guard upon herself, lest she should be betrayed into weakness by her own happiness. She had resolved that in loving her lord she would not worship him, and that in giving her heart she would only so give it as it should be given to a human creature like herself. She had acted on these high resolves, and hence it had come to pass, not unnaturally, that Mr. Godfrey Holmes had told her that it was her fault. She was a pretty, fair girl, with soft, dark brown hair and soft, long, dark eyelashes. Her gray eyes, though quiet in their tone, were tender and lustrous. Her face was oval, and the lines of her cheek and chin perfect in their symmetry. She was generally quiet in her demeanour, but when moved she could rouse herself to great energy, and speak with feeling, and almost with fire. Her fault was a reverence for martyrdom in general, and a feeling, of which she was unconscious, that it became a young woman to be unhappy in secret. That it became a young woman, I might rather say, to have a source of unhappiness hidden from the world in general, and endured without any detriment to her outward cheerfulness. We know the story of the Spartan boy who held the fox under his tunic. The fox was biting into him, into the very entrails, but the young hero spake never a word. Now Bessie Garrow was inclined to think that it was a good thing to have a fox always biting, so that the torment caused no ruining to her outward smiles. Now at this moment the fox within her bosom was biting her sore enough, but she bore it without flinching. "If you would rather that he should not come, I will have it arranged," her mother had said to her. "Not for worlds," she had answered. "I should never think well of myself again." Her mother had changed her own mind more than once as to the conduct in this matter which might be best for her to follow, thinking solely of her daughter's welfare. "If he comes, they will be reconciled, and she will be happy," had been her first idea. But then there was a stern fixedness of purpose in Bessie's words when she spoke of Mr. Holmes, which had expelled this hope, and Mrs. Garrow had for a while thought it better that the young man should not come. But Bessie would not permit this. It would vex her father, put out of course the arrangements of other people, and display weakness on her own part. He should come, and she would endure without flinching while the fox gnawed at her. That battle of the mistletoe had been fought on the morning before Christmas Day, and the Holmeses came on Christmas Eve. Isabella was comparatively a stranger, and therefore received at first the greater share of attention. She and Elizabeth had once seen each other, and for the last year or two had corresponded, but personally they had never been intimate. Unfortunately for the latter, that story of Godfrey's offer and acceptance had been communicated to Isabella, as had, of course, the immediately subsequent story of their separation. But now it would be almost impossible to avoid the subject in conversation. "Dearest Isabella, let it be as though it had never been," she had said in one of her letters. "But sometimes it is very difficult to let things be as though they had never been." The first evening passed over very well. The two Coverdale girls were there, and there had been much talking and merry laughter, rather juvenile in its nature, but on the whole none the worse for that. Isabella Holmes was a fine, tall, handsome girl, good-humoured and well disposed to be pleased, rather Frenchified in her manners, and quite able to take care of herself. But she was not above round games, and did not turn up her nose at the boys. Godfrey behaved himself excellently, talking much to the Major, but by no means avoiding Miss Garrow. Mrs. Garrow, though she had known him since he was a boy, had taken an aversion to him since he had quarrelled with her daughter; but there was no room on this first night for showing such aversion, and everything went off well. "Godfrey is very much improved," the Major said to his wife that night. "Do you think so?" "Indeed I do. He has filled out and become a fine man." "Oh, in personal appearance, you mean? Yes, he's well-looking enough." "And in his manner, too. He is doing uncommonly well in Liverpool, I can tell you. And if he should think of Bessie—" "There is nothing of that sort," said Mrs. Garrow. "He did speak to me, you know, 2 years ago. Bessie was too young then, and so indeed was he. But if she likes him—" "I don't think she does." "Then there's an end of it." And so they went to bed. "Frank," said the sister to her elder brother, knocking at his door when they had all gone upstairs, "may I come in, if you are not in bed?" "In bed?" said he, looking up with some little pride from his Greek book. "I've got 150 lines to do before I can get to bed. It'll be 2, I suppose. I've got to mug uncommon hard these holidays. I have only one more half, you know, and then—" "Don't overdo it, Frank." "No, I won't overdo it. I mean to take 1 day a week, and work 8 hours a day on the other 5. That will be 40 hours a week, and will give me just 200 hours for the holidays. I have got it all down here on a table. That will be 105 for Greek play, 40 for algebra," and so he explained to her the exact destiny of all his long hours of proposed labour. He had as yet been home a day and a half, and had succeeded in drawing out with red lines and blue figures the tables which he showed her. "If I can do that, it will be pretty well, won't it?" "But, Frank, you've come home for your holidays, to enjoy yourself." "But a fellow must work nowadays." "Don't overdo it, dear, that's all." "But, Frank, I could not rest if I went to bed without speaking to you. You made me unhappy to-day." "Did I, Bessie?" "You called me a Puritan, and then you quoted that ill-natured French proverb at me. Do you really believe your sister thinks evil, Frank?" And as she spoke she put her arm caressingly around his neck. "Oh, of course I don't." "Then why say so? Harry is so much younger and so thoughtless that I can bear what he says without so much suffering. But if you and I are not friends, I shall be very wretched. If you knew how I have looked forward to your coming home." "I did not mean to vex you, and I won't say such things again." "That's my own, Frank. What I said to mamma, I said because I thought it right. But you must not say I am a Puritan. I would do anything in my power to make your holidays bright and pleasant. I know that boys require so much more to amuse them than girls do. Good night, dearest. Pray don't overdo yourself with work, and do take care of your eyes." So saying, she kissed him and went her way. In 20 minutes after that he had gone to sleep over his book, and when he woke up to find the candle guttering down, he resolved that he would not begin his measured hours till Christmas Day was fairly over. The morning of Christmas Day passed very quietly. They all went to church, and then sat round the fire chatting until the 4 o'clock dinner was ready. The Coverdale girls thought it was rather more dull than former Thwaite Hall festivities, and Frank was seen to yawn. But then everybody knows that the real fun of Christmas never begins till the day itself be past. The beef and pudding are ponderous, and unless there be absolute children in the party, there is a difficulty in grafting any special afternoon amusements on the Sunday pursuits of the morning. In the evening they were to have a dance. That had been distinctly promised to Paddy Coverdale, but the dance would not commence till 8. The beef and pudding were ponderous, but with due efforts they were overcome and disappeared. The glass of port was sipped, the almonds and raisins were nibbled, and then the ladies left the room. 10 minutes after that, Elizabeth found herself seated with Isabella Holmes over the fire in her father's little book-room. It was not by her that this meeting was arranged, for she dreaded such a constrained confidence. But of course it could not be avoided, and perhaps it might be as well now as hereafter. "Bessie," said the elder girl, "I am dying to be alone with you for a moment." "Well, you shall not die, that is, if being alone with me will save you." "I have so much to say to you, and if you have any true friendship in you, you also will have so much to say to me." Miss Garrow perhaps had no true friendship in her at that moment, for she would gladly have avoided saying anything, had that been possible. But in order to prove that she was not deficient in friendship, she gave her friend her hand. "And now tell me everything about Godfrey," said Isabella. "Dear Bella, I have nothing to tell, literally nothing." "That is nonsense. Stop a moment, dear, and understand that I do not mean to offend you. It cannot be that you have nothing to tell, if you choose to tell it. You are not the girl to have accepted Godfrey without loving him. Nor is he the man to have asked you without loving you. When you write me word that you have changed your mind, as you might about a dress, of course I know you have not told me all. Now I insist upon knowing it. That is, if we are to be friends. I would not speak a word to Godfrey till I had seen you, in order that I might hear your story first." "Indeed, Bella, there is no story to tell." "Then I must ask him." "If you wish to play the part of a true friend to me, you will let the matter pass by and say nothing. You must understand that, circumstanced as we are, your brother's visit here, what I mean is, that it is very difficult for me to act and speak exactly as I should do, and a few unfortunate words spoken may make my position unendurable." "Will you answer me then one question?" "I cannot tell. I think I will." "Do you love him?" For a moment or two Bessie remained silent, striving to arrange her words so that they should contain no falsehood and yet betray no truth. "Ah, I see you do," continued Miss Holmes. "But of course you do. Why else did you accept him?" "I fancied that I did, as young ladies do sometimes fancy." "And will you say that you do not now?" Again Bessie was silent, and then her friend rose from her seat. "I see it all," she said. "What a pity it was that you both had not some friend like me by you at the time; but perhaps it may not be too late." I need not repeat at length all the protestations which upon this were poured forth with hot energy by poor Bessie. She endeavoured to explain how great had been the difficulty of her position. This Christmas visit had been arranged before that unhappy affair at Liverpool had occurred. Isabella's visit had been partly one of business, it being necessary that certain money affairs should be arranged between her, her brother, and the major. "I determined," said Bessie, "not to let my feelings stand in the way, and hoped that things might settle down to their former friendly footing. I already fear that I have been wrong, but it will be ungenerous in you to punish me." Then she went on to say that if anybody attempted to interfere with her, she would at once go away to her mother's sister, who lived at Hexham in Northumberland. Then came the dance, and the hearts of Kate and Paddy Coverdale were at last happy. But here again poor Bessie was made to understand how terribly difficult was this experiment in entertaining, on a footing of friendship, a lover with whom she had quarrelled only a month or two before. That she must as a necessity become the partner of Godfrey Holmes she had already calculated, and so much she was prepared to endure. Her brothers would of course dance with the Coverdale girls, and her father would of course stand up with Isabella. There was no other possible arrangement, at any rate as a beginning. She had schooled herself, too, as to the way in which she would speak to him on the occasion, and how she would remain mistress of herself and of her thoughts. But when the time came, the difficulty was almost too much for her. "You do not care much for dancing, if I remember," said he. "Oh, yes, I do. Not as Paddy Coverdale does. It's a passion with her. But then I am older than Paddy Coverdale." After that he was silent for a minute or two. "It seems so odd to me to be here," he said. It was odd. She felt that it was odd. but he ought not to have said so. 2 years make a great difference. The boys have grown so much." "Yes, and there are other things," said he. "Bella was never here before, at least not with you." "No, but I did not exactly mean that. All that would not make the place so strange. But your mother seems altered to me. She used to be almost like my own mother." "I suppose she finds that you are a more formidable person as you grow older. It was all very well scolding you when you were a clerk in the bank, but it does not do to scold the manager. These are the penalties men pay for becoming great." "Oh, it is not my greatness that stands in my way, but then I'm sure I cannot say what it is. But Patty will scold you if you do not mind the figure, though you were the whole board of directors packed into one. She won't respect you if you neglect your present work." When Bessie went to bed that night, she began to feel that she had attempted too much. "Mamma," she said, "could I not make some excuse and go away to Aunt Mary?" "What, now?" "Yes, mamma, now, tomorrow. I need not say that it will make me very unhappy to be away at such a time, but I begin to think that it will be better." "What will papa say?" "You must tell him all." "And Aunt Mary must be told also. You would not like that. Has he said anything?" "No, nothing. Very little, that is. But Bella has spoken to me." "Oh, mamma, I think we have been very wrong in this. That is, I have been wrong. I feel as though I should disgrace myself and turn the whole party here into a misfortune." It would be dreadful, that telling of the story to her father and to her aunt, and such a necessity must if possible be avoided. Should such a necessity actually come, the former task would no doubt be done by her mother, but that would not lighten the load materially. After a fortnight she would again meet her father, and would be forced to discuss it. "I will remain, if it be possible," she said. "But, mamma, if I wish to go, you will not stop me?" Her mother promised that she would not stop her, but strongly advised her to stand her ground. On the following morning, when she came downstairs before breakfast, she found Frank standing in the hall with his gun, of which he was trying the lock. "It is not loaded, is it, Frank?" said she. "Oh, dear, no. No one thinks of loading nowadays till he has got out of the house. Directly after breakfast I am going across with Godfrey to the back of Greystock, to see after some moorfowl. He asked me to go, and I couldn't well refuse." "Well, of course not. Why should you?" "It will be deuced hard to make up the time. I was to have been up at 4 this morning, but that alarm went off and never woke me. However, I shall be able to do something to-night." "Don't make a slavery of your holidays, Frank. What's the use of having a new gun if you're not to use it?" "It's not the new gun. I'm not such a child as that comes to. But you see, Godfrey is here, and one ought to be civil to him. I'll tell you what I want you girls to do, Bessie. You must come and meet us on our way home. Come over in the boat and along the path to the Patterdale Road. We'll be there under the hill about 5. "And if you are not, we are to wait in the snow." "Don't make difficulties, Bessie. I tell you we will be there. We are to go in the cart, and so shall have plenty of time." "And how do you know the other girls will go?" "Why, to tell you the truth, Patty Coverdale has promised. As for Miss Holmes, if she won't, why, you must leave her at home with mamma. But Kate and Patty can't come without you." "Your discretion has found that out, has it?" "They say so. But you will come, won't you, Bessie? As for waiting, it's all nonsense. Of course you can walk on, but we'll be at the stile by 5. I've got my watch, you know." And then Bessie promised him. What would she not have done for him that was in her power to do? "Go? Of course I'll go," said Miss Holmes. "I'm up to anything. I'd have gone with them this morning, and have taken a gun if they'd asked me. But, by the by, I'd better not." "Why not?" said Patty, who was hardly yet without fear lest something should mar the expedition. "What will 3 gentlemen do with 4 ladies?" "Oh, I forgot," said Patty, innocently. "I'm sure I don't care," said Kate. "You may have Harry if you like." "Thank you for nothing," said Miss Holmes. "I want 1 for myself. It's all very well for you to make the offer, but what should I do if Harry won't have me? There are 2 sides, you know, to every bargain." "I'm sure he isn't anything to me," said Kate. "Why, he's not quite 17 years old yet." Poor boy! What a shame to dispose of him so soon! We'll let him off for a year or two, won't we, Miss Coverdale? But as there seems to be acknowledgment to be one beau with unappropriated services—" "I'm sure I have appropriated nobody," said Patty, "and didn't intend." "Godfrey, then, is the only knight whose services are claimed," said Miss Holmes, looking at Bessie. Bessie made no immediate answer with either her eyes or tongue, but when the Coverdales were gone she took her new friend to task. "How can you fill those young girls' heads with such nonsense?" "Nature has done that, my dear." "But nature should be trained, should it not? You will make them think that those foolish boys are in love with them." "The foolish boys, as you call them, will look after that themselves. It seems to me that the foolish boys know what they are about better than some of their elders." And then, after a moment's pause, she added, "As for my brother, I have no patience with him." "Pray do not discuss your brother," said Bessie. "And, Bella, unless you wish to drive me away, pray do not speak of him and me together, as you did just now." "Are you so bad as that? That the slightest commonplace joke upsets you? Would not his services be due to you as a matter of course? If you are so sore about it, you will betray your own secret." "I have no secret, none at least from you or from mamma, and indeed none from him. We were both very foolish, thinking that we knew each other and our own hearts when we knew neither." "I hate to hear people talk of knowing their hearts. My idea is that if you like a young man and he asks you to marry him, you ought to have him. That is, if there is enough to live on. I don't know what more is wanted. But girls are getting to talk and think as though they were to send their hearts through some fiery furnace of trial before they may give them up to a husband's keeping. I am not at all sure that the French fashion is not the best, and that these things shouldn't be managed by the fathers and mothers, or perhaps by the family lawyers. Girls who are so intent upon knowing their own hearts generally end by knowing nobody's heart but their own, and then they die old maids. Better than give themselves to the keeping of those they don't know and cannot esteem. That's a matter of taste. I mean to take the first that comes, so long as he looks like a gentleman and has not less than 800 a year. Now, Godfrey does look like a gentleman and has double that. If I had such a chance, I wouldn't think twice about it." "But I have no such chance." "That's the way the wind blows, is it?" "No, no. Oh, Bella, pray, pray leave me alone. Pray do not interfere. There is no wind blowing in any way. All that I want is your silence and your sympathy." "Very well. I will be silent and sympathetic as the grave. Only don't imagine that I am cold as the grave also. I don't exactly appreciate your ideas, but if I can do no good, I will at any rate endeavour to do no harm." After lunch at about 3 they started on their walk, and managed to ferry themselves over the river. "Oh, do let me, Bessie," said Kate Coverdale. "I understand all about it. Look here, Miss Holmes, you pull the chain through your hands." "And inevitably tear your gloves to pieces," said Miss Holmes. Kate certainly had done so, and did not seem to be particularly well pleased with the accident. "There's a nasty nail in the chain," she said. "I wonder those stupid boys did not tell us." Of course, they reached the trysting place much too soon, and were very tired of walking up and down to keep their feet warm, before the sportsmen came up. But this was their own fault, seeing that they had reached the stile half an hour before the time fixed. "I never will go anywhere to meet gentlemen again," said Miss Holmes. "It is most preposterous that ladies should be left in the snow for an hour. Well, young men, what sport have you had?" "I shot the big black cock," said Harry. "Did you, indeed?" said Kate Coverdale. "And here are the feathers out of his tail for you. He dropped them in the water, and I had to go in after them up to my middle. But I told you that I would, so I was determined to get them." "Oh, you silly, silly boy!" said Kate. "But I'll keep them forever. I will indeed." This was said a little apart, for Harry had managed to draw the young lady aside before he presented the feathers. Frank also had his trophies for Paddy, and the tale to tell of his own prowess. In that he was a year older than his brother, he was by a year's growth less ready to tender his present to his lady love openly in the presence of them all. But he found his opportunity, and then he and Paddy went on a little in advance. Kate also was deep in her consolations to Harry for his ducking, and therefore the four disposed of themselves in the manner previously suggested by Miss Holmes. Miss Holmes, therefore, and her brother and Bessie Garrow were left together in the path, and discussed the performances of the day in a manner that elicited no very ecstatic interest. So they walked for a mile, and by degrees the conversation between them dwindled down almost to nothing. "There is nothing I dislike so much as coming out with people younger than myself," said Miss Holmes. "One always feels so old and dull. Listen to those children there. They make me feel as though I were an old maiden aunt brought out with them to do propriety. Patty won't at all approve if she hears you call her a child. Nor shall I approve if she treats me like an old woman." And then she stepped on and joined the children. "I wouldn't spoil even their sport if I could help it," she said to herself, "but with them I shall only be a temporary nuisance. If I remain behind I shall become a permanent evil." And thus Bessie and her old lover were left by themselves. "I hope you will get on well with Bella," said Godfrey, when they had remained silent for a minute or two. "Oh, yes, she is so good-natured and light-spirited that everybody must like her. She has been used to so much amusement and active life that I know she must find it very dull here." "She is never dull anywhere, even at Liverpool, which for a young lady I sometimes think the dullest place on earth. I know it is for a man." "A man who has work to do can never be dull, can he?" "Indeed he can, as dull as death. I am so, often enough. I have never been very bright there, Bessie, since you left us." There was nothing in his calling her Bessie, for it had become habit with him since they were children, and they had formerly agreed that everything between them should be as it had been before that foolish whisper of love had been spoken and received. Indeed, provision had been made by them especially on this point, so that there need be no awkwardness in this mode of addressing each other. Such provision had seemed to be very prudent, but it hardly had the desired effect on the present occasion. "I hardly know what you mean by brightness," she said, after a pause. "Perhaps it is not intended that people's lives should be what you call bright." "Life ought to be as bright as we can make it." "It all depends on the meaning of the word. I suppose we are not very bright here at Thwaite Hall, but yet we think ourselves very happy." "I am sure you are," said Godfrey. "I very often think of you here." "We always think of places where we have been when we were young," said Bessie. And then again they walked on for some way in silence, and Bessie began to increase her pace with the view of catching the children. The present walk to her was anything but bright, and she bethought herself with dismay that there were still 2 miles before she reached the ferry. "Bessie," Godfrey said at last, and then he stopped as though he were doubtful how to proceed. She, however, did not say a word, but walked on quickly, as though her only hope was in catching the party before her. But they also were walking quickly, for Bella was determined that she would not be caught. "Bessie, I must speak to you once of what passed between us at Liverpool." "Must you?" said she. "Unless you positively forbid it." "Stop, Godfrey," she said. And they did stop in the path, for now she no longer thought of putting an end to her embarrassment by overtaking her companions. "If any such words are necessary for your comfort, it would hardly become me to forbid them. Were I to speak so harshly, you would accuse me afterwards in your own heart. It must be for you to judge whether it is well to reopen a wound that is nearly healed. But with me it is not nearly healed. The wound is open, always." "There are some hurts," she said, "which do not admit of an absolute and perfect cure, unless after long years." As she said so, she could not but think how much better was his chance of such perfect cure than her own. With her, so she said to herself, such curing was all but impossible, whereas with him it was as impossible that the injury should last. "Bessie," he said, and he again stopped her on the narrow path, standing immediately before her on the way, "you remember all the circumstances that made us part?" "Yes, I think I remember them." "And you still think that we were right to part?" She paused for a moment before she answered him, but it was only for a moment, and then she spoke quite firmly. "Yes, Godfrey, I do. I have thought about it much since then. I have thought, I fear, to no good purpose about aught else, but I have never thought that we had been unwise in that. And yet I think you loved me. I am bound to confess I did so, as otherwise I must confess myself a liar. I told you at the time that I loved you, and I told you so truly. But it is better, 10 times better, that those who love should part, even though they still should love, than that two should be joined together, who are incapable of making each other happy. Remember what you told me." "Oh, I do remember." "You found yourself unhappy in your engagement, and you said it was my fault." "Bessie, there is my hand. If you have ceased to love me, there is an end of it. But if you love me still, let all that be forgotten." "Forgotten, Godfrey? How can it be forgotten? You were unhappy, and it was my fault. My fault, as it would be if I tried to solace a sick child with arithmetic, or feed a dog with grass. I had no right to love you, knowing you as I did, and knowing also that my ways would not be your ways. My punishment I understand, and it is not more than I can bear, but I had hoped that your punishment would have been soon over." "You are too proud, Bessie." "That is very likely. Frank says that I am a Puritan, and pride was the worst of their sins." "Too proud and unbending. In marriage, should not the man and woman adapt themselves to each other?" "When they are married, yes. And every girl who thinks of marrying should know that in very much she must adapt herself to her husband. But I do not think that a woman should be the ivy, to take the direction of every branch of the tree to which she clings. If she does so, what can be her own character? But we must go on, or we shall be too late." "And you will give me no other answer?" "None other, Godfrey. Have you not just now, at this very moment, told me that I was too proud? Can it be possible that you should wish to tie yourself for life to female pride? And if you tell me that now, at such a moment as this, what would you tell me in the close intimacy of married life, when the trifles of every day would have worn away the courtesies of guest and lover?" There was a sharpness of rebuke in this which Godfrey Holmes could not at the moment overcome. Nevertheless, he knew the girl and understood the workings of her heart and mind. Now, in her present state, she could be unbending, proud, and almost rough. In that she had much to lose in declining the renewed offer which he made her, she would, as it were, continually prompt herself to be harsh and inflexible. Had he been poor, had she not loved him, had not all good things seemed to have attended the promise of such a marriage, she would have been less suspicious of herself in receiving the offer, and more gracious in replying to it. Had he lost all his money before he came back to her, she would have taken him at once; or had he been deprived of an eye, or become crippled in his legs, she would have done so. But circumstanced as he was, she had no motive to tenderness. There was an organic defect in her character, which no doubt was plainly marked by its own bump in her cranium, the bump of philo-martyrdom, it might properly be called. She had shipwrecked her own happiness in rejecting Godfrey Holmes. But it seemed to her to be the proper thing that a well-behaved young lady should shipwreck her own happiness. For the last month or two she had been tossed about by the waters, and was nearly drowned. Now there was beautiful land again close to her, and a strong, pleasant hand stretched out to save her. But though she had suffered terribly among the waves, she still thought it wrong to be saved. It would be so pleasant to take that hand, so sweet, so joyous, that it surely must be wrong. That was her doctrine, and Godfrey Holmes, though he hardly analyzed the matter, partly understood that it was so. And yet, if once she were landed on that green island, she would be so happy. She spoke with scorn of a woman clinging to a tree like ivy, and yet, were she once married, no woman would cling to her husband with sweeter feminine tenacity than Bessie Garrow. He spoke no further word to her as he walked home, but in handing her down to the ferry boat he pressed her hand. For a second it seemed as though she had returned this pressure. If so, the action was involuntary, and her hand instantly resumed its stiffness to his touch. It was late that night when Major Garrow went to his bedroom, but his wife was still up, waiting for him. "Well," said she, "what has he said to you? He has been with you above an hour." Such stories are not very quickly told, and in this case it was necessary to understand him very accurately. At length I think I do understand him. It is not necessary to repeat at length all that was said on that night between Major and Mrs. Garrow as to the offer which had now for a third time been made to their daughter. On that evening, after the ladies had gone, and when the two boys had taken themselves off, Godfrey Holmes told his tale to his host, and had honestly explained to him what he believed to be the state of his daughter's feelings. "Now you know all," said he. "I do believe that she loves me, and if she does, perhaps she may still listen to you." Major Garrow did not feel sure that he knew it all; but when he had fully discussed the matter that night with his wife, then he thought that perhaps he had arrived at that knowledge. On the following morning Bessie learned from the maid, at an early hour, that Godfrey Holmes had left Thwaite Hall and gone back to Liverpool. To the girl she said nothing on the subject, but she felt obligated to say a word or two to Bella. "It is his coming that I regret," she said, "that he should have had the trouble and annoyance for nothing. I acknowledge that it was my fault, and I am very sorry." "It cannot be helped," said Miss Holmes, somewhat gravely. "As to his misfortunes, I presume that his journeys between here and Liverpool are not the worst of them." After breakfast on that day, Bessie was summoned into her father's book-room, and found him there, and her mother also. "Bessie," said he, "sit down, my dear. You know why Godfrey has left us this morning?" Bessie walked round the room, so that in sitting she might be close to her mother, and take her mother's hand in her own. "I suppose I do, papa," she said. "He was with me late last night, Bessie, and when he told me what had passed between you, I agreed with him that he had better go." "It was better that he should go, papa." "But he has left a message for you." "A message, papa?" "Yes, Bessie, and your mother agrees with me that it had better be given to you. It is this, that if you will send him word to come again, he will be here by Twelfth Night. He came before on my invitation, but if he returns, it must be on yours." "Oh, papa, I cannot." "I do not say that you can, but think of it calmly before you altogether refuse. You shall give me your answer on New Year's morning." "Mamma knows that it would be impossible," said Bessie. "Not impossible, dearest. In such a matter you should do what you believe to be right," said her father. "If I were to ask him here again, it would be telling him that I would—" "Exactly, Bessie. It would be telling him that you would be his wife. He would understand it so, and so would your mother and I. It must be so understood altogether." "But, papa, when we were at Liverpool—" "I have told him everything, dearest," said Mrs. Garrow. "I think I understand the whole," said the major, "and in such a matter as this I will not give you counsel on either side. But you must remember that in making up your mind you must think of him as well as of yourself. If you do not love him, if you feel that as his wife you should not love him, there is not another word to be said. I need not explain to my daughter that under such circumstances she would be wrong to encourage the visits of a suitor. But your mother says you do love him." "Oh, mamma!" "I will not ask you. But if you do, if you have so told him and allowed him to build up an idea of his life happiness on such telling, you will, I think, sin greatly against him by allowing a false feminine pride to mar his happiness. When once a girl has confessed to a man that she loves him, the confession and the love together put upon her the burden of a duty towards him which she cannot with impunity throw aside." Then he kissed her, and bidding her give him a reply on the morning of the New Year, left her with her mother. She had 4 days for consideration, and they went past her by no means easily. Could she have been alone with her mother, the struggle would not have been so painful. But there was the necessity that she should talk to Isabella Holmes, and the necessity also that she should not neglect the Coverdales. Nothing could have been kinder than Bella. She did not speak on the subject till the morning of the last day, and then only in a very few words. "Bessie," she said, "as you are great, be merciful." "But I'm not great, and it would not be mercy." "As to that," said Bella, "he has surely a right to his own opinion." On that evening she was sitting alone in her room when her mother came to her, and her eyes were red with weeping. Pen and paper were before her, as though she were resolved to write, but hitherto no word had been written. "Well, Bessie," said her mother, sitting down close beside her, "is the deed done?" "What deed, mamma? Who says that I am to do it?" "The deed is not the writing, but the resolution to write. 5 words will be sufficient, if only those 5 words may be written." "It is for one's whole life, mamma, for his life as well as my own." "True, Bessie, that is quite true; but equally true whether you bid him come or allow him to remain away. That task of making up one's mind for life must at last be done in some special moment of that life." "Mamma, mamma, tell me what I should do." But this Mrs. Garrow would not do. "I will write the words for you if you like," she said, "but it is you who must resolve that they shall be written. I cannot bid my darling go away and leave me for another home. I can only say that in my heart I do believe that home would be a happy one." It was morning before the note was written, but when the morning came, Bessie had written it and brought it to her mother. "You must take it to papa," she said. Then she went and hid herself from all eyes till the noon had passed. "Dear Godfrey," the letter ran, "papa says that you will return on Wednesday if I write to ask you. Do come back to us, if you wish it. Yours always, Bessie." "It is as good as though she had filled the sheet," said the major. But in sending it to Godfrey Holmes he did not omit a few accompanying remarks of his own. An answer came from Godfrey by return of post, and on the afternoon of the 6th of January Frank Garrow drove over to the station at Penrith to meet him. On their way back to Thwaite Hall there grew up a very close confidence between the 2 future brothers-in-law, and Frank explained with great perspicuity a little plan which he had arranged himself. "As soon as it is dark, so that she won't see it, Harry will hang it in the dining room," he said, "and mind you go in there before you go anywhere else." "I am very glad you have come back, Godfrey," said the major, meeting him in the hall. "God bless you, dear Godfrey," said Mrs. Garrow. "You will find Bessie in the dining room," she whispered; but in so whispering she was quite unconscious of the mistletoe bough. And so also was Bessie, nor do I think that she was much more conscious when that introduction was over. Godfrey had made all manner of promises to Frank, but when the moment arrived he had found the moment too important for any special reference to the little bough above his head. Not so, however, Patty Coverdale. "It's a shame," said she, bursting out of the room, "and if I'd known what you had done, nothing on earth would have induced me to go in. I won't enter the room till I know that you've taken it out." Nevertheless, her sister Kate was bold enough to solve the mystery before the evening was over. End of The Mistletoe Bough by Anthony Trollope. Number 9 of A Christmas Miscellany, 2018, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Number 9, Christmas Eve in a Lumber Camp, by Ralph Connor. It was due to a mysterious dispensation of Providence, and a good deal to Leslie Graham, that I found myself in the heart of the Selkirks for my Christmas Eve, as the year 1882 was dying. It had been my plan to spend my Christmas far away in Toronto, with such bohemian and boon companions as could be found in that cosmopolitan and kindly city. But Leslie Graham changed all that, for discovering me in the village of Blackrock, with my traps all packed, waiting for the stage to start for the landing 30 miles away, he bore down upon me with resistless force, and I found myself recovering from my surprise only after we had gone in his lumber sleigh some 6 miles on our way to his camp up in the mountains. I was surprised and much delighted, though I would not allow him to think so, to find that his old-time power over me was still there. He could always, in the old varsity days, dear wild days, make me do what he liked. He was so handsome and so reckless, brilliant in his class work, and the prince of half-backs in the Rugby field, and with such power of fascination as would extract the heart out of a wheelbarrow, as Barney Lundy used to say. And thus it was that I found myself just 3 weeks later (I was to have spent 2 or 3 days), on the afternoon of December 24, standing in Graham's lumber camp No. 2, wondering at myself. But I did not regret my changed plans, for in those 3 weeks I had raided a cinnamon bear's den and had wakened up a grizzly. But I shall let the grizzly finish the tale. He probably sees more humor in it than I. The camp stood in a little clearing, and consisted of a group of 3 long, low shanties with smaller shacks near them, all built of heavy, unhewn logs, with door and window in each. The grub camp, with cook shed attached, stood in the middle of the clearing. At a little distance was the sleeping camp, with the office built against it, and about 100 yards away on the other side of the clearing stood the stables, and near them the smithy. The mountains rose grandly on every side, throwing up their great peaks into the sky. The clearing in which the camp stood was hewn out of a dense pine forest that filled the valley, and climbed halfway up the mountain sides, and then frayed out in scattered and stunted trees. It was one of those wonderful Canadian winter days, bright, and with a touch of sharpness in the air that did not chill, but warmed the blood like draughts of wine. The men were up in the woods, and the shrill scream of the blue jay flashing across the open, the impudent chatter of the red squirrel from the top of the grub camp, and the pert chirp of the whiskey jack hopping about on the rubbish heap, with the long, lonely cry of the wolf far down the valley, only made the silence felt the more. As I stood drinking in with all my soul the glorious beauty and the silence of mountain and forest, with the Christmas feeling stealing into me, Graham came out from his office, and catching sight of me, called out, "Glorious Christmas weather, old chap!" and then, coming nearer, "Must you go to-morrow?" "I fear so," I replied, knowing well that the Christmas feeling was on him too. "I wish I were going with you," he said quietly. I turned eagerly to persuade him, but at the look of suffering in his face the words died on my lips, for we both were thinking of the awful night of horror when all his bright, brilliant life crashed down about him in black ruin and shame. I could only throw my arm over his shoulder and stand silent beside him. A sudden jingle of bells roused him, and giving himself a little shake, he exclaimed, "There are the boys coming home." Soon the camp was filled with men talking, laughing, chaffing like light-hearted boys. "They are a little wild to-night," said Graham, "and to-morrow they'll paint Blackrock red." Before many minutes had gone, the last teamster was washed up, and all were standing about waiting impatiently for the cook's signal. The supper to-night was to be something of a feed, when the sound of bells drew their attention to a light sleigh drawn by a buckskin bronco coming down the hillside at a great pace. "The preacher, I'll bet, by his driving," said one of the men. "Bedad, and it himmed out a fine nose for turkey," said Blaney, a good-natured, jovial Irishman. "Yes, or for payday, more like," said Keefe, a black-browed, villainous fellow countryman of Blaney's, and, strange to say, his great friend. Big Sandy McNaughton, a Canadian Highlander from Glengarry, rose up in wrath. "Bill Keefe," said he, with deliberate emphasis, "you'll just keep your dirty tongue off the minister. And as for your pay, it's little he sees of it, or any one else except Mike Slevin, when you're too dry to wait for some one to treat you, or perhaps Father Ryan, when the fear of hellfire is on you." The men stood amazed at Sandy's sudden anger and length of speech. "Bon, that's good for you, my bully boy," said Baptiste, a wiry little French Canadian, Sandy's sworn ally and devoted admirer ever since the day when the big Scotchman, under great provocation, had knocked him clean off the dump into the river and then jumped in for him. It was not till afterward I learned the cause of Sandy's sudden wrath which urged him to such unwonted length of speech. It was not simply that the Presbyterian blood carried with it reverence for the minister, but that he had a vivid remembrance of how, only a month ago, the minister had got him out of Mike Slavin's saloon and out of the clutches of Keefe and Slavin and their gang of bloodsuckers. Keefe started up with a curse. Baptiste sprang to Sandy's side, slapped him on the back, and called out, "You kill him. I'll eat him up, me." It looked as if there might be a fight, when a harsh voice said in a low, savage tone, "Stop your row, you fools. Settle it, if you want to, somewhere else." I turned and was amazed to see old man Nelson, who was very seldom moved to speech. There was a look of scorn on his hard, iron-gray face, and of such settled fierceness as made me quite believe the tales I had heard of his deadly fights in the mines at the coast. Before any reply could be made, the minister drove up and called out in a cheery voice, "Merry Christmas, boys! Hello, Sandy! Comment ça va, Baptiste? And how do you do, Mr. Graham?" "First rate. Let me introduce my friend, Mr. Connor, sometime medical student, now artist, hunter, and tramp at large, but not a bad sort." "A man to be envied," said the minister, smiling. "I am glad to know any friend of Mr. Graham's." I liked Mr. Craig from the first. He had good eyes that looked straight out at you, a clean-cut, strong face, well set on his shoulders, and altogether an upstanding, manly bearing. He insisted on going with Sandy to the stables to see Dandy his bronco put up. "Decent fellow," said Graham, "but though he is good enough to his bronco, it is Sandy that's in his mind now." "Does he come out often? I mean, are you part of his parish, so to speak?" "I have no doubt he thinks so, and I'm blowed if he doesn't make the Presbyterians of us think so, too." And he added after a pause, "A dandy lot of parishioners we are for any man. There's Sandy now, he would knock Keefe's head off as a kind of religious exercise. But tomorrow Keefe will be sober, and Sandy will be drunk as a lord, and the drunker he is, the better Presbyterian he'll be, to the preacher's disgust." Then, after another pause, he added bitterly, "But it is not for me to throw rocks at Sandy. I am not the same kind of fool, but I am a fool of several other sorts." Then the cook came out and beat a tattoo on the bottom of a dishpan. Baptiste answered with a yell, but though keenly hungry, no man would demean himself to do other than walk with apparent reluctance to his place at the table. At the further end of the camp was a big fireplace, and from the door of the fireplace extended the long board tables covered with platters of turkey not too scientifically carved, dishes of potatoes, bowls of apple sauce, plates of butter, pies, and smaller dishes distributed at regular intervals. 2 lanterns hanging from the roof and a row of candles stuck into the wall on either side by means of slit sticks cast a dim, weird light over the scene. There was a moment's silence, and at a nod from Graham, Mr. Craig rose and said, "I don't know how you feel about it, men, but to me this looks good enough to be thankful for." "Fire ahead, sir," called out a voice quite respectfully, and the minister bent his head and said, "For Christ the Lord who came to save us, for all the love and goodness we have known, and for these thy gifts to us this Christmas night, our Father make us thankful. Amen." "Bon, that's first rate," said Baptiste. "Seems like that make me eat more better for sure." And then no word was spoken for a quarter of an hour. The occasion was far too solemn, and moments too precious for anything so empty as words. But when the white piles of bread and the brown piles of turkey had for a second time vanished, and after the last pie had disappeared, there came a pause and a hush of expectancy, whereupon the cook and cookee, each bearing aloft a huge blazing pudding, came forth. "Hooray!" yelled Blaney. "Up with yez!" And grabbing the cook by the shoulders from behind, he faced him about. Mr. Craig was the first to respond, and seizing the cookee in the same way, called out, "Squad, fall in! Quick march!" In a moment every man was in the procession. "Strike up, Batchies, ye little angel!" shouted Blaney, the appellation a concession to the minister's presence, and away went Baptiste in a rollicking French song with the English chorus. Then blow ye winds in the morning, blow ye winds, ayo, blow ye winds in the morning, blow, blow, blow. And at each blow every boot came down with a thump on the plank floor that shook the solid roof. After the second round, Mr. Craig jumped upon the bench and called out, "3 cheers for Billy the cook!" In the silence following the cheers, Baptiste was heard to say, "Bon, that make me feel like that pudding. I'll help myself, me." "Here till the little baste," said Blaney in disgust. "Batchees," remonstrated Sandy gravely, "you've more stomach than manners." "For sure, but the more stomach that's more the better for the pudding," replied the little Frenchman cheerfully. After a time the tables were cleared and pushed back to the wall, and pipes were produced. In all attitudes suggestive of comfort, the men disposed themselves in a wide circle about the fire, which now roared and crackled up the great wooden chimney hanging from the roof. The lumberman's hour of bliss had arrived. Even old man Nelson looked a shade less melancholy than usual as he sat alone, well away from the fire, smoking steadily and silently. When the second pipes were well a-going, one of the men took down a violin from the wall and handed it to Lachlan Campbell. There were 2 brothers Campbell, just out from Argyll, typical Highlanders. Lachlan, dark, silent, melancholy, with the face of a mystic, and Angus, red-haired, quick, impulsive, and devoted to his brother, a devotion he thought proper to cover under biting, sarcastic speech. Lachlan, after much protestation, interposed with jibes from his brother, took the violin, and in response to the call from all sides, struck up Lord Macdonald's reel. In a moment the floor was filled with dancers, whooping and cracking their fingers in the wildest manner. Then Baptiste did the Red River Jig, a most intricate and difficult series of steps, the men keeping time to the music with hands and feet. When the jig was finished, Sandy called for "Lochaber no more," but Campbell said, "No, no, I cannot play that tonight. Mr. Craig will play." Craig took the violin, and at first note I knew he was no ordinary player. I did not recognize the music, but it was soft and thrilling, and got in by the heart, till every one was thinking his tenderest and saddest thoughts. After he had played 2 or 3 exquisite bits, he gave Campbell his violin, saying, "Now, Lochaber, Lachlan." Without a word Lachlan began not Lochaber, he was not ready for that yet, but "The Flowers of the Forest," and from that wandered through "Auld Robin Gray" and "The Land of the Leal," and so got at last to that most soul-subduing of Scottish laments, "Lochaber no more." At the first strain, his brother, who had thrown himself on some blankets behind the fire, turned over on his face, feigning sleep. Sandy McNaughton took his pipe out of his mouth and sat up straight and stiff, staring into vacancy, and Graham, beyond the fire, drew a short, sharp breath. We had often sat, Graham and I, in our student days, in the drawing-room at home, listening to his father wailing out Lochaber upon the pipes, and I knew well that the awful minor strains were now eating their way into his soul. Over and over again the Highlander played his lament. He had long since forgotten us, and was seeing visions of the hills and lochs and glens of his far-away native land, and making us, too, see strange things out of the dim past. I glanced at old man Nelson, and was startled at the eager, almost piteous look in his eyes, and I wished Campbell would stop. Mr. Craig caught my eye, and, stepping over to Campbell, held out his hand for the violin. Lingeringly and lovingly the Highlander drew out the last strain, and silently gave the minister his instrument. Without a moment's pause, and while the spell of Lochaber was still upon us, the minister, with exquisite skill, fell into the refrain of that simple and beautiful camp-meeting hymn, "The Sweet By and By." After playing the verse through once, he sang softly the refrain. After the first verse the men joined in the chorus. At first timidly, but by the time the third verse was reached, they were shouting with throats full open, "We shall meet on that beautiful shore." When I looked at Nelson, the eager light had gone out of his eyes, and in its place was a kind of determined hopelessness, as if in this new music he had no part. After the voices had ceased, Mr. Craig played again the refrain, more and more softly and slowly. Then, laying the violin on Campbell's knees, he drew from his pocket his little Bible and said, "Men, with Mr. Graham's permission, I want to read you something this Christmas Eve. You will all have heard it before, but you will like it none the less for that." His voice was soft, but clear and penetrating, as he read the eternal story of the angels and the shepherds and the babe. And as he read, a slight motion of the hand or a glance of an eye made us see, as he was seeing, that whole radiant drama. The wonder, the timid joy, the tenderness, the mystery of it all were borne in upon us with overpowering effect. He closed the book, and in the same low, clear voice went on to tell us how, in his home years ago, he used to stand on Christmas Eve listening in thrilling delight to his mother telling him the story, and how she used to make him see the shepherds and hear the sheep bleating near by, and how the sudden burst of glory used to make his heart jump. "I used to be a little afraid of the angels, because a boy told me they were ghosts. But my mother told me better, and I didn't fear them any more. And the baby, the dear little baby. We all love a baby." There was a quick, dry sob. It was from Nelson. I used to peek through under to see the little one in the straw, and wonder what things swaddling clothes were. Oh, it was so real and so beautiful. He paused, and I could hear the men breathing. "But one Christmas Eve," he went on in a lower, sweeter tone, "there was no one to tell the story, and I grew to forget it, and went away to college, and learned to think that it was only a child's tale, and was not for men. Then bad days came to me, and worse, and I began to lose my grip of myself, of life, of hope, of goodness, till one black Christmas, in the slums of a far-away city, when I had given up all, and the devil's arms were about me, I heard the story again. And as I listened, with a bitter ache in my heart, for I had put it all behind me, I suddenly found myself peeking under the shepherd's arms with a child's wonder at the baby in the straw. Then it came over me like great waves that his name was Jesus, because it was he that should save men from their sins. Save! Save! The waves kept beating upon my ears, and before I knew, I had called out, "Oh, can he save me?" It was in a little mission meeting on one of the side streets, and they seemed to be used to that sort of thing there, for no one was surprised, and a young fellow leaned across the aisle to me and said, "Why, you just bet he can." His surprise that I should doubt his bright face and confident tone gave me hope that perhaps it might be so. I held to that hope with all my soul, and, stretching up his arms, and with a quick glow in his face and a little break in his voice, "He hasn't failed me yet. Not once. Not once." He stopped quite short, and I felt a good deal like making a fool of myself, for in those days I had not made up my mind about these things. Graham, poor old chap, was gazing at him with a sad yearning in his dark eyes. Big Sandy was sitting very stiff and staring harder than ever into the fire. Baptiste was trembling with excitement. Blaney was openly wiping the tears away, but the face that held my eyes was that of old man Nelson. It was white, fierce, hungry-looking, his sunken eyes burning, his lips parted as if to cry. The minister went on, "I didn't mean to tell you this, men. It all came over me with a rush, but it is true, every word, and not a word will I take back. And what's more, I can tell you this, what he did for me he can do for any man, and it doesn't make any difference what's behind him, and," leaning slightly forward and with a little thrill of pathos vibrating in his voice, "oh, boys, why don't you give him a chance at you? Without him you'll never be the men you want to be, and you'll never get the better of that's keeping some of you now from going back home. You know you'll never go back till you're the men you want to be." Then lifting up his face and throwing back his head, he said, as if to himself, "Jesus, he shall save his people from their sins." And then, "Let us pray." Graham leaned forward with his face in his hands. Baptiste and Blaney dropped on their knees. Sandy, the Campbells, and some others stood up. Old man Nelson held his eyes steadily on the minister. Only once before had I seen that look on a human face. A young fellow had broken through the ice on the river at home, and as the black water was dragging his fingers one by one from the slippery edges, there came over his face that same look. I used to wake up for many a night after in a sweat of horror, seeing the white face with its parting lips and its piteous, dumb appeal, and the black water slowly sucking it down. Nelson's face brought it all back, but during the prayer the face changed and seemed to settle into resolve of some sort, stern, almost gloomy, as of a man with his last chance before him. After the prayer, Mr. Craig invited the men to a Christmas dinner next day in Black Rock. "And because you are an independent lot, we'll charge you $50 for dinner and the evening show." Then, leaving a bundle of magazines and illustrated papers on the table, a godsend to the men, he said good-bye and went out. I was to go with the minister, so I jumped into the sleigh first and waited while he said good-bye to Graham, who had been hard hit by the whole service and seemed to want to say something. I heard Mr. Craig say cheerfully and confidently, "It's a true bill. Try him." Sandy, who had been steadying Dandy while that interesting bronco was attempting with great success to balance himself on his hind legs, came to say good-bye. "Come and see me first thing, Sandy." I know I'll see you, Mr. Craig," said Sandy, earnestly, as Dandy dashed off at a full gallop across the clearing and over the bridge, steadying down when he reached the hill. "Steady, you idiot!" This was to Dandy, who had taken a sudden side spring into the deep snow, almost upsetting us. A man stepped out from the shadow. It was old man Nelson. He came straight to the sleigh, and ignoring my presence completely, said, "Mr. Craig, are you dead sure of this? Will it work?" "Do you mean," said Craig, taking him up promptly, "can Jesus Christ save you from your sins and make a man of you?" The old man nodded, keeping his hungry eyes on the other's face. "Well, here's his message to you. The Son of Man is come to seek and save that which was lost." "To me? To me?" said the old man eagerly. "Listen, this too is his word. 'Him that cometh unto me I will in no wise cast out.' That's for you, for here you are, coming." "You don't know me, Mr. Craig. I left my baby 15 years ago because—" "Stop," said the minister. "Don't tell me, at least not tonight, perhaps never. Tell him who knows it all now and who never betrays a secret. Have it out with him. Don't be afraid to trust him." Nelson looked at him with his face quivering, and said in a husky voice, "If this is no good, it's hell for me." "If it is no good," replied Craig almost sternly, "it's hell for all of us." The old man straightened himself up, looked up at the stars, then back at Mr. Craig, then at me, and drawing a deep breath, said, "I'll try him." As he was turning away, the minister touched him on the arm and said quietly, "Keep an eye on Sandy tomorrow." Nelson nodded, and we went on. But before we took the next turn, I looked back and saw what brought a lump into my throat. It was old man Nelson on his knees in the snow, with his hands spread upward to the stars. And I wondered if there was any one above the stars, nearer than the stars, who could see. And then the trees hid him from my sight. End of Christmas Eve in a Lumber Camp by Ralph Connor. Number 10 of A Christmas Miscellany 2018 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Number 10, A Little Boy and Santa Claus by Walter A. Dyer. Once upon a time there was a little boy who believed in Santa Claus. Why he thus believed he did not know. When one is a small boy, one finds it easier to believe in things than not. He did not inquire as to the reason for the good saint's existence. He did not wonder why Santa Claus should choose to be so generous on one particular day. Cause and effect were matters of small importance compared with the net results of sleds and Noah's arks. When Christmas morning came, and the sunlight streaming in through frosted window panes woke the little boy, he made a dash for the mantel where his stocking was hung. There were the jumping jacks and the Christmas candy just where he knew they would be, irrefutable evidence of the midnight visit of the good white saint. Faith in things not seen is in little danger so long as the evidence of things hoped for fails us not. The whole situation suited the little boy, and he believed in Santa Claus. But he was a very inquisitive small boy, and though the bigger mystery of Santa Claus troubled him not at all, he was a bit perplexed by certain material details. He observed that there was no real fireplace in the house. A scientific turn of mind was his by inheritance, and forced him to pursue his investigations. At length he formulated the important question, how did Santa Claus get in? The grown-ups, they were unusually clever for grown-ups, it seems, told him that Santa Claus could make himself very small at will, and came in through the drafts of the kitchen range after the fire went out. This proved a satisfactory solution of the problem for a time, as it did not occur to the small boy to inquire whether the grown-ups always allowed the fire to go out on the night before Christmas, though he was a bit puzzled as to how any saint, even a collapsible saint, could drag a large sled through a small stovepipe. Alas, the small boy was born in a scientific and materialistic age, and the spirit of investigation was upon him. He could not let the matter drop. He made an exhaustive study of it, and one by one scented out the flaws in the argument. He took notice of the hesitation of the women grown-ups in answering his questions, and the false notes in the facetious remarks of the men grown-ups. He observed the smile of patronizing superiority on his older sister's face. He began to doubt, and doubt is the beginning of knowledge. Before many years had passed, he had run the question down, and the grown-ups, finding themselves cornered, were forced to admit that there was no such thing as Santa Claus. I was that little boy. Ah, well I remember how it seemed that my heart would break when I learned the appalling truth. I left the unsympathetic company of obtuse grown-ups, and threw myself down on the sofa in another room, and turning my face to the wall, I wept bitterly. I had lost something that day that can never be replaced. I am not at all in sympathy with those who think it a sin to perpetuate what they are pleased to refer to as the Santa Claus lie. Personally, I must confess to a feeling of smallness and awe when I stand before a child who honestly believes in Santa Claus. And yet I fear that his hold upon us is weakening. The age of fable has passed. Must old St. Nicholas go too? This growing scorn for delightful unrealities gives me some concern, for it is an indication of a psychological change in the human race that I do not like to contemplate. One by one the myths of childhood vanish. Bogeymen and fairy godmothers gradually lose their power over us. One by one the myths of man depart, and Pan lies low beneath our hurrying feet. We have put our faith in a god of gold and steel, and Phoebus no longer rides upon the sunset. We are a practical people, and we glory in it. We waste not our energies in vain dreaming of things that may not be. We have risen above that foolishness. We are after tangible results, and we get them. But after all, are tangible results all that the soul craves? May we not be degenerating into mere men of prose and calculation? How long will there be among us real children and real poets? Where now is the poet who can invent a myth, or the child who can believe in one? Alice in Wonderland, I believe, was the last great mythology. Even Peter Pan did not wholly convince us. "We have played Jack Horner with our earth," said James Russell Lowell, lamenting in his journal, "till there is never a plum left in it," thereby implying, I presume, that each iconoclastic scientist saith in his stony heart, "Lo, what a brave boy am I!" The best of our poets have felt alarm at this systematic and progressive disillusioning of the world. Thus Poe to science: "Hast thou not dragged Diana from her car, and driven the Hamadryad from the wood to seek a shelter in some happier star? Hast thou not torn the Naiad from the flood, the Elfin from the green grass, and from me the summer dream beneath the tamarind tree? And thus Wordsworth. I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn, so might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. It is not the disbelief in these old myths that brings pain. It is the destruction of belief, the breaking down of the idols. It may be fun, but it is short-sighted and silly. I believe I would sooner perjure myself than be the one to tell a child that there is no such thing as Santa Claus. And if your brother believes in the power of prayer, you are a knave if you attempt to shatter his faith. This iconoclasm has gone far enough. Let us build us new idols if we can. At least let us destroy no more old ones. And speaking of Christmas, has it ever occurred to you that we may perhaps be doing ourselves and posterity immeasurable injury by forgetting the beauty of the story that the day is supposed to commemorate? But we cannot hope to rebuild the faith of the world in myth and fairy lore. The day of miracles has passed. People don't read poetry anymore. People don't pray anymore. This is the age of specialization, and those of us who want our souls to grow must fight always against the tendency of our lives to narrow down to a single channel. For every man there lies a rut ready to receive him. This is the trend of the times, and it will take patience and much united energy to combat it. The task may be too big for us, but we may be able to do something to prevent our own lives from becoming entirely hardened. And that is what makes this thing worth talking about. The most materialistic old curmudgeon of us all sometimes looks back with regretful longing toward the fresh, unspoiled, unsophisticated, wondering days of childhood. Indeed, I fancy that some of our modern men and women have reason to indulge in some of this regretful retrospection from about the age of 12. We envy our earlier selves, and we regret the loss of those very things that we have struggled so valiantly to grow away from. What is it that makes childhood so alluring? What is it in the old memories that haunts us? Why is it that those halcyon hours come nevermore? We have been growing old too fast. We have been losing that freshness of interest in all things, that mental alertness that made us as children, that made earlier people so different from what we are now. Until we regain, by an effort of the will, somewhat of this childlike spirit, we shall continue to plod along, with half of our minds working overtime and the other half asleep. For one thing, we live too much in cities these days. Cities are manufactured out of material ingredients. Their steel and concrete lives enchain our souls. Myths were never born in cities, but in groves and by the sea. It is there that the imagination is stimulated. There is no such thing as Pan in Wall Street. Do you remember how you used to lie awake after they had put you to bed and weave romances about yourself? Do you remember the countless Indians you slew when you were a little boy, or the fairy princes that came to woo you when you were a little girl? Now, when you lie awake o' nights, you think of business, don't you? Have you ever made an effort to do otherwise? Have you ever tried to put that part of your mind to sleep by waking up the other part, the old child part that knew how to pretend? I have, and I tell you, it pays. I have learned to turn my mind deliberately to a dream I have of a farm in Massachusetts, where I and one other stand amid our blossoming apple trees and survey the land that is ours. The sound of a cowbell is blown faintly from over the hill above which fleecy clouds are lazily drifting. Our dog is dashing madly about the stone wall on the fancied scent of a woodchuck. Our chickens are busying themselves about their manifold duties. Our neighbor Jones is driving by to town, and is waving a salute with his whip. Our farmhouse nestles beneath its lofty elms, the picture of content. Oh, it pays to dream of it when the day's work is done, whether there be any substance to the dream or not. I don't believe there is one of us so steeped in the cares of middle age that we cannot break the chains if we will. If we will. That's the point. Most of us don't even think about doing it. We know that something is wrong with our lives, but we don't stop to study out what it is. But if we will only stop to consider, we shall see that it is possible to make our lives richer by training our minds to be more elastic and our imaginations livelier. The desk-ridden man of 50, whose joints are growing stiff and whose circulation is becoming defective, can renew his youth and limber up marvelously by a persistent application of the golf cure. He can do the same with his mind, if he will. For after all, this is a life of illusions, only now we have substituted middle-aged illusions for those of childhood. Your idea of your own importance is an illusion. Your idea of the importance of your work is another. Your Monday morning blues are as much the result of illusion as was your Saturday morning ecstasy some 30 or 40 years ago. Oh, those happy days of childhood when we believed in Santa Claus! Let them come once more, once more. Let us relearn the art of playing. Let us relearn the art of imagining. Let us regain a little of the old simplicity. We moved our household a little while ago, and as we overhauled our possessions, we came upon many things that awakened memories. There were presents that we gave and received on Christmases gone by. There were humble gifts of the days when the pennies meant even more than they do now, gifts that meant sacrifice for love, gifts that fell far short of what we wished we could afford. They were the best we could do. I wonder what it was about those old Christmas presents that made the tears come. I fancy it was the awakened memory of a time when everything meant so much and was so tremendously appreciated. And then and there we registered a prayer that we might never become so rich that Christmas presents would no longer mean sacrifice. It is that simplicity of mind, that appreciativeness of the good that comes, that makes us love Mrs. Wiggs and the Five Little Peppers. And if the day should ever come when that spirit has departed from our Christmases, it will be a sadder day, 1,000 times, than the one on which I lost my Santa Claus. End of A Little Boy and Santa Claus by Walter A. Dyer. Number 11 of A Christmas Miscellany 2018 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Number 11, The December Surprise, The Telephone Santa Claus by Patton Beard. The December Surprise. Of course, you know as well as Dottie that there was a pen wiper in the first Christmas pocket. The writing on that pocket said, not to be opened till after you have seen all your presents from the Christmas tree on Christmas Eve. Marjorie liked the pen wiper ever so much. She said that it could be used at school. It was made of round red circles of cloth and had a button sewed at its center. The story pocket was quite bulky, and it said, "Open on Christmas Eve for a bedtime story." Marjorie read it aloud as she and Dot curled up in a big, cozy, comfortable at bedtime. They had to have a very special dispensation from Mother. She said that the surprise book story that came on Christmas Eve might keep the bedtime light lit till it was finished. So Marjorie read aloud The Telephone Santa Claus. The shops were full of Christmas toys. There were Christmas greens and fir trees everywhere. Big ribbon-trimmed holly wreaths began to appear in front windows, and everybody in the streets carried Christmas bundles. At this time, too, Mary Louise, who lived in a large and beautiful house with Mother and Daddy, and who was the only little girl they had, began to plan what she should ask Santa Claus to bring her. Can anybody ever have too many toys? Mary Louise had a whole toy closet full. There were certain very best toys put by Nurse on the top shelf for special occasions, and there were countless everyday toys, some of them a bit broken, but a great many of them quite whole and splendid, ever so much nicer than the toys that Mary Louise's little friends had to play with. Still, Mary Louise wanted more toys. The list that she now was writing in her round, wiggly handwriting had already covered several sheets of large pad paper that Nurse had given her. Mary Louise sat at the big flat desk in the library. Her velvet dress was almost lost in the big armchair that was Daddy's favorite. Behind her was a cheerful fire on the hearth, and it snapped and crackled joyously. Mary Louise's blue eyes traveled about the room as if seeking fresh inspiration in the objects that they rested upon. She already had everything, but she wanted more, and so she put the pencil on the paper and continued the letter to Santa Claus. "I want 2 new teddy bears, the biggest you have, Santa Claus," the pencil said. "I want one that is pure white like snow and another that is furry and brown. Both should have a squeak, and if you have any that will growl, I'd like that kind, too. I want a white doll carriage lined with pink satin. They have them at Bunty's department store, for I saw them once, and they cost $25. I want a big doll to go in it. I want a whole wardrobe of clothes for it, a new doll cradle, and it must have a pink silk dress, too. I want a doll that will open and shut its eyes, one with real hair. It must talk, too. You can bring me, beside this, a boy doll with a sled and all the different kinds of clothes that a little boy ought to wear. I want a real toy automobile with a horn and a lamp, not the kind that is like a tricycle, because I already have one like that. I mean the real kind that runs with gasoline. They cost $125, maybe a little more, but I don't think you mind what they cost. I want a doll house that is nicer than the one you gave me before. It ought to be big enough for me to go into myself, and I would like to have it built in the garden like a real house. You can put it down by the greenhouses because it will be too big to bring into our house or carry down the chimney, I know. And then, too, I want—" Mary Louise's blue eyes considered the ceiling for a space of time. "I want a ring like Mother's, one with a blue stone in it," she added. While she was trying to think of something else to ask for, the door of the library opened, and in walked Mary Louise's big daddy. He glanced for a minute at Mary Louise, and he took up the telephone. Mary Louise's daddy was busy there several minutes. He watched Mary Louise nibbling the end of her pencil, and he looked over her shoulder at the letter. As he did so, a smile crossed his face. "Writing to Santa Claus, Mary Louise?" he asked when he put down the receiver. "I was wondering what to ask for next," Mary Louise informed him. "I think I'll ask for another pony. Nibbles is very nice, of course, but I'd rather like one that will trot faster. I think I'd like a white pony with a white kid harness and a white basket cart." "You're asking for a great many things, aren't you?" Daddy suggested. "Maybe it might be well to close the letter now. I'll take it with me and mail it on the way downtown. Better address the envelope." "I might think of something more," remonstrated Mary Louise, but she folded the 6 sheets of pad paper and put them into the envelope that Daddy held out. Then she addressed it to Mr. Santa Claus, Santa Claus Land, Santa Claus Country, North Pole, exactly as Nurse had told her. Daddy put it into his overcoat pocket as Mary Louise had seen him put letters that he posted for Mother. Then, as the library door closed, she plumped herself down upon the thick black fur rug in front of the fire to look at a picture book. She had not been there very long when the telephone bell rang. James didn't come as he ought, and Marie was upstairs, so Mary Louise incommoded herself by getting up from the rug to answer it. It had already rung 3 times, and she was quite ready to scold Marie for not answering it. But she did not have the chance, as Marie still did not come. So Mary Louise took up the receiver. "Hello?" she called. "Hello," came a cheery answer. "What is it?" inquired Mary Louise. "I want to talk to Miss Mary Louise Snow," came the answer. "I'm Santa Claus." "Oh, I'm her!" gasped Mary Louise. I'm her!" Never before had Santa Claus called Mary Louise up by telephone. Never had she spoken to him, except for a few brief minutes at a Christmas party celebration. "You are?" returned the voice. "Well, I'm glad you are at home, Mary Louise. There's something very special that I want to talk about. It's almost time for me to receive your usual Christmas letter. I suppose there are a great many things that you will want. Have you been a good little girl this year?" Oh, sometimes, Mary Louise faltered. I have tried very hard not to have tantrums. Maybe I did once or twice, but I tried not to say things when Marie would unsnarl my hair. Have you learned your multiplication tables? Up to sevens, answered Mary Louise. I think I can say them, but I can't always remember what 7 times 9 is, and I forget 7 times 12. That sounds as if you had tried fairly well, the voice of Santa Claus commented. There are a great many Christmas presents that you would like, I suppose. Well, yes, returned Mary Louise. Oh, yes, Santa Claus. I just wrote you my letter, and I hadn't quite finished it when Daddy came in and took it to mail, so maybe I'll write another later on. I didn't ask for any games or things. I might send another letter when I think of what I want. If you like, I will tell you the things that I asked for in my first letter, if I can remember them. I want a big, big doll that can talk, and it must have real hair and shut and open its eyes, and it must have blue eyes and real eyelashes, too. I asked for a pink silk dress and gloves, I think. I can't remember. And there were 2 big teddy bears with a growl and a squeak both. Very big bears, one pure white and the other furry and brown. I want a white pony, too, and a white cart and harness. The letter will tell you all about that. I forget all that I said in the letter, she explained. It was most 6 pages long of big pad paper. Oh, that was rather long, chuckled Santa Claus. Yes, smiled Mary Louise, but I think I forgot to say that I wanted gloves for the doll. I'm not sure I can bring the gloves, Santa Claus said. I think, however, that I might get the doll to you. Would you rather have a doll than the 2 teddy bears? I want both, replied Mary Louise. It seems strange that Santa Claus should not understand a thing as simple as that. Teddy bears are very popular, I know, but I guess you must have ever so many, and you've usually brought me nicer things than you've given other little girls that I know. Well, maybe I can bring a teddy bear, if there's one left over, Mary Louise, but I'm not at all sure I can bring the pony this year, you know. I'm afraid I've got to cut down on your presents, Mary Louise. That's why I called up. I have something very, very important to ask you. I want to know if you can help me. I'm trying to distribute my gifts more properly this year. You know, of course, Mary Louise, that there are ever so many little children that do not get Christmas presents, especially in wartime. Are there? Inquired Mary Louise. I suppose it's the children who have been naughty? Oh, no. What is it, then? It's not because I forget them or because they are naughty, explained Santa Claus's voice. It's because too many goodies go to the rich little children. Then the poor little children who would like toys, they have nothing. Oh, gasped Mary Louise. Then I suppose you've given me more than my share. I'm afraid so, answered Santa. Don't the poor children have anything? Sometimes I've given to the wrong people, came the evasive answer. You see, I have a great deal to do. I ought to have a lot of people to help me. How can one person do it all? Sometimes I don't find the right children, and I use up the things that grow in the Santa Claus land, and then I have nothing left after the long, long lists are made up for the very particular little rich children. Oh, dear! Yes, that's why. Do you want to give up some of your things this year so that they can go to the poor children? Mary Louise reflected. Which? She asked. Do you mean the doll, or the pony, or the automobile, or the new dollhouse? You have about 100 dolls, haven't you? No, corrected Mary Louise, only just 76, counting the little bits of china ones in the dollhouse. Without these there are about 40, but only 20 are big ones. Well, chuckled Santa Claus, that seems to me a good deal too many. You could give up the doll, I think. Suppose that you were a little girl who had never had any doll ever. Well, but I'd like the pink doll. I'll tell you what, Santa Claus suggested. You think things over. Maybe I'll find that I can spare a pink doll for you after all. But I want you to help me look out for some of the poor children this year, and I want you to buy at least 6 presents out of your very own money. I want you to find some children that I ought to know about. I want you to help them for me. I'll telephone you some addresses where there are poor children, and you must write these down and keep them, and see that the boys and girls have proper Christmas presents. Will you do it? "Oh, yes, Mr. Santa Claus, gladly," returned Mary Louise. "I have $19 in the bank, I think. My daddy will help me." "No, I don't want your daddy to help you. It's to be your very own money." "All right, I'll not ask him. Of course, I want to help you, Mr. Santa Claus. I'd love to do it." "Well, good-bye. If I can, I'll come on Christmas Eve to your tree. You do the very best you can, Mary Louise, and invite the poor children to share your tree." The receiver was hung up at the other end of the line, and Mary Louise stood bewildered before the library table, where she had just written her long Christmas list. She stood there thinking it all over from beginning to end. She had been asked to help Santa Claus. It was a great distinction. Poor, overworked Santa Claus had appealed to her as a very rich little girl who already had everything, and she mightn't get the pink doll at all. Then Mary Louise could not keep the secret any longer, and she dashed up the stairs to Mother's room. She wouldn't let Mother go out of the room till she had told her the whole story, and Mother had a very important engagement and was all ready to go out in the car. Together they emptied Mary Louise's bank and counted out exactly $19.53. Mary Louise wanted to take it and start right out in the car to buy the presents, but with difficulty Mother explained that she had better wait till Santa Claus sent in the names and she had found out what the children wanted. And Santa Claus did telephone the names. Mary Louise was at dinner, and James answered the telephone. Mary Louise felt badly that she had not been called, but there was no need to take her away from dinner. James had the addresses on the telephone pad, Mother said. She was sure they were right. Mary Louise wished Daddy were home. It seemed to her that he would never come. As she felt sure she would need to buy a tree for the Christmas party, she got Nurse to take her to that shop in the afternoon. But it is wonderful to think that a Christmas tree costs money. Before this, Mary Louise had never considered the subject. It was a very tall tree, and it was an expensive tree. The charge for it ate into the $19.53 considerably. The things that went onto the tree must all be new. Santa Claus must see that Mary Louise had bought new ones to please him. So she bought ever so many stars and birds and balls of red, yellow, blue, green, white, silver, gold. And there was need of tinsel. If Mary Louise had had her own way, she would have spent almost all the $19.53 just on that tree without thinking of the consequences. Why, if she had, how could she have bought any presents for the poor children? Next day, after having told Daddy all about it, she wrote to the addresses that Santa Claus had given her. She wrote the letters in ink and used her very best blue note paper. All the letters were sealed with a Santa Claus sticker. It did take a great deal of time, I assure you. The invitations were to Mamie and Johnny and Toby Smith. They were to Tony Patino and Lily Wicks and Benny Wicks, who lived in a part of the city Mary Louise had never seen. Nurse said it was a very sad part of the city. When Mary Louise asked if she might go there and see it and see the children, Nurse said she guessed Santa Claus didn't know what he was talking about. She guessed not. Mary Louise insisted, but all in vain. Santa Claus had told her what the children's ages were and left the gifts to Mary Louise's selection. When Daddy had taken the letters to the poor children in his overcoat pocket to mail, Mary Louise fell to planning about the gifts. Only one little girl, all boys. How dreadful! But Mother helped Mary Louise by suggesting things that little boys might like. From her own playthings, Mary Louise selected her biggest doll for Lily, and would have given her ever so many other dolls had not Mother thought that Mary Louise might add other little girls to her Christmas list of poor children, and make the helping of Santa Claus more equally distributed among those who might otherwise be forgotten. How fast the $19.53 did go, just buying the tree and the fixings, and the sled and the overcoat and mittens and skates and carts and baseball bats. It was a tragic moment when Mary Louise suddenly discovered that Benny had been neglected and didn't have as many gifts as the others. She consulted Daddy, as there were no boys' toys among her playthings, and nothing seemed right. Daddy said, well, he said she might work and earn the money to buy Benny a present. Never in her life had Mary Louise worked to earn money. How can I earn money? She asked. Daddy thought, if you will learn the 7 times 7 table and the 8 and 9 and any of the others, I'll give you $1 for every one you can say perfectly. That's very special, Mary Louise, because it's Christmas, you know. Dear me, to think of having to sit down quietly in all the excitement of Christmas rush and learn horrid multiplication tables. If anything was work, that surely was. But where there's a will, there's a way, and Mary Louise did it. She did it so well that she remembered all of the 7 table perfectly. She also went on and learned the 8 and 9 tables and the 10 table. That was easy. Then, being quite enthusiastic, she tried hard at the others and mastered the 12 table after keeping at it a steady day. With the proceeds of these earnings, paid gravely by Daddy, she was able to buy Benny a game, and when she went to buy it and found some little poor children right by the car that stopped at the entrance of Bunty's department store, she was able to invite them then and there and go right in and buy presents for them. They needed woolen scarves and mittens, and Mary Louise had found presents on the toy shelf among the toys kept for very special occasions. These would do for them. When once Mary Louise had started to help Santa Claus, there was no knowing where it would end. Whenever she went out, she saw little children whom she was sure Santa Claus had forgotten because they looked so wistfully in at shop windows. Some of them Nurse let her speak to, and she added these to her list for the party. There seemed to be no table of 13 to learn, but Daddy gave $1 for every poem she could recite, and Mary Louise knew ever so many, and it was easy to learn short ones. Oh, dear! How the time did fly! Before Mary Louise knew it, Christmas Eve was there. There had been all the fun of fixing the tree, and Daddy and Mother had helped. Mary Louise hoped Santa Claus wouldn't disappoint her. She hoped that he surely would come. She was very much relieved when James came in and said that he had just been asked to deliver a message that came from Santa Claus over the telephone. It was a telegram, and it said, "Will be at your Christmas party, Christmas Eve, 8 o'clock, Santa Claus." After that, Mary Louise didn't worry. She let Marie take the tangles out of her hair and help her into her very best pink silk dress, and then she dashed downstairs to wait for all the guests who had been invited to come. She wanted to play games with them, and she wanted to tell them all about Santa Claus, and she hoped they would like to sing carols and dance around the tree. But most of all she hoped that they would like the presents she had arranged for them at Santa Claus's suggestion. Oh, wouldn't it be fun to see Santa Claus give out the big white teddy bear, and the big brown fuzzy bear, and the pink doll, and the cart, and the skates, and... But here the doorbell rang, and there was a scuffle of happy feet. It was Lily and Benny and Tony, and all the rest. They were as happy could be. Mary Louise greeted them all, and then they beamed upon her almost as if she were Santa Claus herself. But I just wish you could have heard the shrieks of delight when the front door bell rang and James ushered in Santa Claus himself. It was just too bad that Daddy wasn't there to see all the fun, though Mother did hope that maybe he might be able to come later. Oh, what a good time they all did have! It was the very best and happiest Christmas that Mary Louise had ever had. It was wonderful. Why, Mary Louise had such a good time that she forgot all about the pink doll till Santa Claus came and gave it to her, after giving out all the other gifts. It was the very doll that Mary Louise had wanted, but she asked Santa Claus to be sure he could spare it, and that he had neglected nobody else to give her the doll. He said he guessed not, at least he hoped not, and then they sat on the sofa and ate ice cream together, while Santa Claus joked and told stories. But he couldn't stay very long, he said, and he had to go. Then, just afterwards, alas, in came Daddy, who might have met Santa Claus if only he had got there a wee bit sooner. And the children danced around the tree and sang carols. And then they all wished Mary Louise a happy Christmas, and went home with arms laden with packages that they hugged tight and smiled and chuckled over. After the children went, there was just Mother and Daddy left. They both kissed Mary Louise and vowed that they'd have another party again next year, maybe. Then Daddy took Mary Louise upon his knee and put a little blue ring upon her finger. It was the kind of a ring that Mary Louise had wanted, one just like Mother's, only little. And Mother told Mary Louise that her Christmas present was the dollhouse. It was coming as soon as possible. It was so big that one could play inside, and it was to be placed right close to the garden greenhouses. It was a Christmas that Mary Louise never forgot and couldn't forget, even if it had not been for the blue ring and the multiplication tables. End of The December Surprise, The Telephone Santa Claus by Patton Beard.